Anita Powell from the correspondent for Voice of America. She's in our studios now, expecting that press conference from Philadelphia in just a moment. Anita, good afternoon to you. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask you a question as an American citizen rather than as a journalist, but how are you feeling?
I'm going to have as many white hairs as you by the end of this season. This is a nail biter. And you know what I think is really important to remember is that the United States, unlike South Africa, doesn't have a centralized election counting mechanism. So these are 50-plus different elections. This is going to be a nail-biter. This is going to take a bit of time. And right now we're just seeing that play out in 8 states that are still up in the air. But it's definitely tense. But, you know, you and I are here in beautiful Johannesburg, not, you know, in the Trump campaign or in the Biden campaign. So I think we're lucky.
We still have nails, at least for now. I mean, it's such an interesting point that you make, because you talk about the 50 states. And I was reminded by an epidemiologist of all people the other day that epidemiologically speaking, the US is 50 different countries. It's sort of the same politically and sort of not. And what I mean by that is that you have different states with very different characteristics. And yet, I mean, look at that Wisconsin figure. These are people who all live together in the same geographic space. There's just 0.2 percentage points between them.
So I want to jump on that and talk about 2 states in particular. We're talking about Pennsylvania right now. One of my colleagues, Isha Sarai, is in Pennsylvania right now reporting on what citizens are saying. And she said, I feel like I've just traveled across the entire country in 8 hours. Because if you go to Bucks County, PA, it's extremely red. And then if you go to the metropoles of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, the mood changes. And so even a state just like Pennsylvania, which me being a Texan, I'm going to call a small state, is, you know, has a lot of diversity in it. You could say that about many of the states in our country. I mean, Texas, you could really say, is 5 states in terms of demographic, ethnic, and political divisions. So this was bound to happen. It is interesting that it is as close as it is. But, you know, people are wondering how much of that is the so-called red mirage. I'm sure you've heard this term. The in-person voting skewing Republican, whereas the mail-in voting we anticipate is going to skew Democrat. But who knows?
I want to talk a little bit more about the electoral system. And I mean, for us, and I'm sure you've covered our elections, you know, all you do is you go to the Electoral Commission website, the IEC website, and you get this very clear picture. You know, they have a nice graphic and they tell you exactly what's going on. In the US, it's so much more complicated. There's been a lot of conversation about the sort of media almost confusing for its own ends the way that these elections work in terms of trying to call the election too early and making comments like that. But it is a much more complicated system than ours, and that means there's a lot more scope for someone to come out and claim victory or someone else to come out and tell their supporters to keep the faith, even if they think they might lose.
Right. As you say, it is a significantly more complicated system, and it is governed by the states, which means that every state gets to make its own electoral guidelines. For example, in my home state of Texas, mail-in voting is not allowed unless you have an excuse. It's not just automatic that you can vote by mail. In Pennsylvania, which we're all waiting so eagerly for, the election officials can't start counting the mail-in ballots until after they count the live ballots. So it kind of makes it seem like the states, I mean, it's not ceteris paribus. It's not all other things considered equal, because everybody's playing a different game, basically. And that's what makes this so confusing and, yeah, and I think so confounding for people. But as we know, the Electoral College system was founded as a measure to try to stop Americans from electing demagogues. And, you know, the changing population, the changing demographics of the U.S. have made it such that we now have smaller states in what we might call the flyover country, the red wall, whatever you want to call it, that punch above their weight electorally. And so you look at if you look at just the population map, if you just look at the population, the popular vote, it's concentrated in the population centers in the states, which are bi-coastal, and it skews blue. But because of the system, you know, the framers of the Constitution wanted states like Nebraska and Arizona and Michigan to have equal status.
such an interesting conversation to have about what is the best electoral system. I mean, we're about to start a big conversation around ours, I think. There is, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but there is, and you see it on Twitter, everyone makes the same joke a million different ways, and it's still funny. Sorry. And in which I say, so for example, is the African Union sending election observers to the US? There are plenty of people, and this happened 20 years ago with the Bush versus Gore election, where, people would say, look, we're able to have an election very peacefully, why can't the US do it? I mean, I'm sure you're sick of the comparison by now.
No, not at all. Not at all. And in fact, I've spent a lot of time talking to people who are either working with the African Union or adjacent to the African Union who believe that, why shouldn't the U.S. have election observers? If the U.S. sends, the Carter Center or, I'm forgetting the name, I'm blanking on the name of some of the other big election observing shops that come to Africa and observe elections, shouldn't our own elections be just as able to be scrutinized? Now, the problem, of course, is COVID. So we don't have actual election observers from Africa in the U.S. There was a small delegation from the West African nation of Cameroon that did go to try to observe the American election, but I haven't heard back from them yet. I'm not sure what they've concluded. But don't you think it's interesting that this election is somewhat playing out like a lot of the elections I've covered on this continent? I mean, I've covered 19 elections on this continent. And in every single one, you have claims of victory before the vote counting is done. You have a lot of controversy over the voter roll, over access to the vote. You have an opposition candidate who many voters see as purely an opposition candidate, independent of his or her policy. And you have the threat, sadly, of violence.
You also have the power of incumbency. And we've seen that being abused in the past. I mean, that's why people were so surprised, for example, in Malawi's recent elections, when the incumbent gave up powers. Why people were so surprised in the Kenyan elections when the president actually ended up complying with the Supreme Court ruling to have the elections again. It's hard to say, though, if the power of incumbency is working as well in the US as it has in some other places. I don't know if it quite gives Trump the same advantage.
It's not supposed to.
It's the short answer.
Yeah. I mean, yes, of course, the incumbent always has that advantage because he or she is always given extra media coverage because they're still governing while they're running for re-election. But yeah, that's a dangerous conversation because that leads us to things like, what can Trump do if he decides that he has in fact won, which he did articulate at 2 in the morning for many Americans? He said, we've won this election. It's time to stop counting. What can he do with that? Where can he go with that? I don't know.
There's a big conversation to have around why your country is so divided. You're allowed to say, well, Stephen, have you looked at yours? Okay, because, I mean, we know that ours is divided. What's always astonished me about the US is that our divisions tend to do with racialized inequality. In the US, you have people who come from the same economic background and often have radically different views. I've never sort of been able to understand why that is. And I mean, there's some geography to it, but that doesn't nearly come close to sort of explaining it in the way that geography explains our election results, for example.
Well, there are a lot of cultural movements that influence people's viewpoints in the States. You could cite, for example, the evangelical church, which does lean, the evangelical churches, there are many, of course, that do lean more conservative socially, which is how the Republicans kind of brought them in. And the people who are members of those congregations tend to skew that way. I mean, my glib American answer is that we don't play identity politics, Stephen. We're all, independent people who make up our own minds regardless of our ethnic background and our so on and so forth.
We don't do political tribalism in the US.
No, we don't. But, well, that's not entirely true, but it is true to a greater extent, I think, in the US, that you can have supporters who you might not expect of the different parties. You might have, for example, the Trump black vote, which the Trump campaign has been really forceful about promoting. You might not expect that. In South Africa, for example, I have yet to meet a black South African who has voiced any approval or support for Donald Trump?
I've spoken to two.
Oh, really? What did they say?
So I think they appreciate the honesty, except, of course, that voting is a very personal thing. And so it's very interesting. Let's have a look at this. So a couple of supporters of the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, they've been talking. Some of their supporters have been talking today. They thought that he was going to have a landslide victory. Now they say they're disappointed that the US President Donald Trump has won key states like Florida and is closing the gap between the candidates.
It's early, and we have always known that tonight it was going to look bad because most Biden voters voted early and voted by mail, and so it's going to take a while to count the vote. So I'm still optimistic, and I'm still
Yeah, so I thought that Biden would win very easily as of like 3 years ago, or 3 hours ago, and now I'm pretty sure that Trump is going to win, and it's upsetting. I think there's going to be some civil unrest here in Oakland.
But I thought what was going on in the country with everything, with the violence and the uproar, I thought Biden was going to pull it off. But obviously, I think Trump is going to probably win.
I'm okay with a tight battle. I think the test of patience is what the American people are going to have to kind of learn. I think to get the right count, we just got to be patient. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm a patient guy. So I'll be okay.
We should count every vote.
We should count every vote, absolutely. I mean, we got to count them all, you know what I'm saying? We have to count them all.
Okay, so that's how they're feeling this afternoon. We've got plenty more to come. We've managed to drag Professor Gilbert Kariagala and Professor Somadoda Fikeni. They're back with us. Anita Powell from Voice of America staying with you. We're also expecting that big press conference in the next few moments live from the US. Stay with us. Do you have anything you want me to bring up? Thank you for saying.
Oh, no. Yeah, I don't know.
So I'd like to, just before the break, we were exploring the issue of political tribes.
Okay.
So I think we might sort of just go to that choice. We'll talk about political tribes.
And I can talk about why people were so surprised.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
I'm on camera 3 here. Good afternoon to you. Special edition of Newsfeed this afternoon, looking at the results of the US presidential elections. We don't have a final result yet for you. Joining us now, Professor Gilbert Kariagala is the director of the African Center for the Study of the US. Professor Somadoda Fikeni is a political analyst at UNISA, and of course Anita Powell, Southern African correspondent for Voice of America. We've been discussing this issue of political tribes, Anita, and I find this fascinating that you have these huge divisions in the United States. And I mean, for many years, when you spoke about tribes, you would be talking about, people often of different language groups. But Professor Fikeni, in the US, when we talk about political tribes, we're often talking about markers around religion, around where people live, and around the media that they consume.
Without any doubt, you find the US is fragmented into different people because of their beliefs, because of their social classes at times, their race, and so forth. And these have over time fossilized. That's why very often in most of the elections, when you look at the map, there are areas which are traditionally Republican, traditionally Democratic. And remember, in an American system, you just have those two major players and nothing else in between. If there are any other players, they are very minor or marginal. So the tribes do have two options, A or B. That's all they have. Hence, their expressions now in protest in other forms take on different forms precisely because the political system has not allowed for plurality of existence. Even the lobby groups, you either camp in Washington, set up offices in order to align yourself to Republicans because you know in terms of regulated industries they will always vote this way, and you align with Democrats because they will always go this way. So it's an ecosystem that has been reproducing itself.
Professor Kadiagala, I was interested in the word that Professor Fikeni used about fossilized. I mean, when something is fossilized, you suggest that the system can't actually change. Is that where the US is now?
You know, I don't think I would put it that dramatically.
We're going to have to put Anita between the two of you.
No, I think because even though you have very clear distinctions between Republicans and Democrats, there are people who are born Democrats, and they will always vote Democrat. There are people who are born Republicans, and they'll always vote Republicans. But you have the moderates. So all the time, every year, we have people in the middle who I think who can shift either way. So I know it's stuck and it's not going to change much, but I think there is a lot of flexibility because you have people who can then move between parties, particularly if there's an emerging leader who they like, and they don't really need to vote Democrat, even though maybe they will be inclined to vote Democratic. So the moderate center, I think, is important. And I think this is what produces the kind of consensus in U.S. politics.
But hasn't the floating voter disappeared? I mean, I don't know if there were any floating voters in this election.
I don't think, the race is very close, and the numbers are very stark. So the middle ground or the moderates tend to be lost in this kind of starkness. But I think they still make a difference because they have voted. We don't really know how many of them how many of them voted, but I think we'll get those figures at the very end. So the moderate middle cannot actually be discounted. I think they are still there. It is just that I think in an election like this that is so polarized, you tend to bring out more of your troops, whether you are Trump or a Biden. You do a lot to actually bring your troops on the table so that they probably look like they're overshadowing the moderates. But we'll see how they have voted.
Anita, are there floating voters left?
Ooh, that's a tough question, but I do agree with the distinguished professors, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that, guys. I mean, and I feel like part of it is that political parties write a narrative every election season in which they develop these sort of arbitrary demographies. And I'm talking about soccer moms. I'm talking about NASCAR dads. Joe Sixpack. I don't even know what that means. What is Joe Sixpack? Can you explain that to me? And then my favorite, because the U.S. is such a diverse country, as a person of Indian origin, my favorite voting bloc is the Patel Motel Cartel, because apparently 50% of motels in the United States are owned by Gujarati Americans, whose surname is Patel. And yeah, so we have all of these fascinating political subcultures that frankly, I'm not sure what they align with. What is a soccer mom? I'm a mom. I've watched a soccer game. I don't understand. What's a soccer mom? What's a NASCAR dad? Help me out with this, guys.
Professor Fikeni?
Actually, the system is a lot more complicated than even these sub-tribes. The U.S. has institutionalized its national interests. Irrespective of any president who comes in, there is a certain parameter, especially its global imperial interest, that are not to be disturbed. And then once you do have that, not much shifts. And the middle that my brother is talking about has become thinner and thinner the more you had polarizing figures. Even when you had an Obama who was trying to reach out, the mere fact that America had to deal with the psychological trauma of having this black man who had risen to a certain level, that alone created these polarities where people were beginning to say, what is it to be an American? Remember that the base, especially your rural and conservatives in many areas, they have this notion of what being an American is, whether it subscribes to reality or not. Now, with the demographic shifts, which are even projecting that by 2030, 2040, whites will not even be a majority, there is a lot of seismic shifts which are taking place underneath. And that you go to the southern states like Florida, some parts of Texas, in some shops, the teller can only speak Spanish in some areas. All those kinds of things are actually shifting, and some people are retreating to their own bases, but the middle and the moderates are shrinking. Even the compromises in the Congress are getting fewer and fewer.
Professor Kadiagala, I'd like to just pick up on this a little bit, because, I mean, and I think, Professor Vakini, you made such an interesting point about, you know, they sort of suffered through Obama in a way. And I sort of take the point that you're making about certain parts of American society. But it strikes me that Trump, the election of Trump, and I think, Professor, you're exactly right, was a reaction in part to Obama. You would not have had, without 8 years of Obama, you would not have had Trump. I think we can say that. But I think we can take that further. I would say that without 8 years of George W. Bush, Texan oil man, you would not have had Obama. You wouldn't have had Bush without 8 years of Clinton. And the point I'm trying to make is that America, like many other democracies, might swing to the left and right. So if we have 8 years of Trump, that's a big, long swing all the way to the right. Now, look at what's coming up in the United States. Black Lives Matter. I'm struggling for a better phrase, but the sort of rise of wokeness, and I realize that's not the right phrase, and I'm perhaps using that incorrectly. But what I'm talking about is if we have another 4 years of Trump, 4 years after that, could we have a big swing to the left in the United States, especially with the demographic change?
That is what energizes the system, that after every 4 years or 8 years, then you swing to the other extreme. I don't think there is anything wrong with that. Otherwise, you'll have a very homogenized political structure.
But if they get more extreme, we're going to end up with fascism.
Again, the moderate. Again, not really the moderate. Let me just use the word here, the moderate center, particularly in other institutions like Congress, then comes in. So I don't think you'll see polarization that tears that society apart. I think you'll still have institutions that actually can return everybody to some sanity, to some center. That's my reading of it.
I love your optimism, I really do. But I mean, something like 50, a large number of Republicans and Democrats think that the other side are evil. Anita?
Yeah, I was about to say, I don't think we've had this much of a pendulum swing before in the United States. I mean, if you look at George W. Bush's compassionate conservatism and some of the messaging he made about immigrants to the United States, people seeking asylum, his language sounds much more like Biden's than Trump's famous campaign announcement words, which I'm not going to repeat, in which he talked about immigrants to the United States and accused them of committing crimes and being bad people. I mean, the Overton window, as we call it, in politics, has just gotten wider and wider. And I think we are now...
You're going to have to go back a bit. What's an Overton window?
Okay, so the Overton window is basically this notion that you take things to their furthest logical extension, you try on different theories, and you make them so wacky and crazy that your second or third less wacky or crazy theory now sounds sensible. So, Stephen, I think, for example, that you should wear a little bit of makeup. And then
I am.
Yes, you are. But if I push you and push you and push you and I have you in full... Yeah.
So, Stephen, I think you should dress up like a clown. Ends up with Stephen actually still looking silly, but not quite a clown.
Yeah, sure. So, I think it's a little... We've swung to quite an extreme now, I think.
Professor, I can give you 30 seconds.
Actually, for me, I wouldn't want us to confine this to the U.S. alone.
Yeah.
Trump has become a symbol of right-wing groups across Europe, across everywhere else, in the time when identity politics is rising to the surface, much because globalization has failed to be inclusive. Hence, people now are retreating to their primordial identities. And that is part of a seismic shift that whether Biden or anybody comes in, you'll have to deal with. And unfortunately, the extremes are getting entrenched. The moderates are even moderating their language. So that's the thing, is that the other extremes are so sharp. And we mustn't take away the fact that the Tea Party came in. It was not a winning party, but it changed the agenda of the Republicans. So the neoconservative idealism or ideology is shifting over time, irrespective of who is the candidate. Just like, Clinton tried realizing that the years of Reagan, the years of Bush had moved in a certain way, he tried to move to the center. So there are these cyclical moves, but at the same time, seismic shifts and trends which have a global implication.